kita sudah menyelenggarakan webinar seri pertama waktu itu tentang pilkada regional election. Untuk webinar seri yang kedua ini kita mengambil topik Indonesia under Prabowo-Gibran's leadership, ya, prospect and challenge on demokrasi, diplomasi, and religious issues. Saya kira topik ini sangat penting ya dan menarik untuk kita bahas ya bersama. Tentu melihat bahwa Prabowo-Gibran sudah terpilih menjadi presiden dan wakil presiden, kabinet juga sudah dibentuk ya dengan segala pro dan kontranya. Tentu ya, tidak objektif ya kalau kita evaluasi ya karena belum 100 hari katanya begitu ya. Jadi malam hari ini kita lebih melihat kepada istilahnya prospek dan tantangan ya yang akan dihadapi oleh pemerintahan Prabowo-Gibran. Untuk welcome speech ya, mungkin saya ingin mengutip ya hasil survei Litbang Kompas yang terbaru ya, September 2024. Hasilnya adalah mayoritas penduduk Indonesia itu optimis. Pak Ufen ya, most of Indonesian people, we are optimistic with the new regime. Saya bacakan misalnya ya, dalam hal stabilitas politik dan keamanan, hasil survei Kompas itu 76% responden itu menyatakan yakin bahwa pemerintahan Prabowo-Gibran akan bisa menjaga stabilitas politik dan keamanan. Kemudian penegakan hukum 74% responden juga yakin. Pertumbuhan ekonomi 72%. Aspek-aspek sosial 73%. So more than 70% of Indonesian people according to Kompas survey, we believe trust in the leadership of Prabowo-Gibran. Kalau menurut Litbang Kompas ada beberapa alasan, baik faktor internal maupun faktor eksternal. Faktor internal, misalnya disebutkan bahwa transisi dari pemerintahan sebelumnya ya, dari Jokowi Ma'ruf Amin ke Prabowo-Gibran itu kan semangatnya keberlanjutan ya. So Prabowo-Gibran are continuing what has been doing ya by previous regime. Itu yang pertama. Kemudian yang kedua juga memang ada istilahnya ya, ada imbas ya bahwa kepercayaan masyarakat terhadap rezim Jokowi Ma'ruf juga tinggi, sehingga karena keberlanjutan tadi kepercayaan masyarakat terhadap Prabowo Gibran juga istilahnya kena imbasnya ya. Saya kira itu angka-angka ya, kita bisa percaya bisa tidak. Justru malam hari ini mungkin kita akan we go deeply lah ya with the data gitu kan. Apakah memang keyakinan dan optimisme yang dimiliki kebanyakan rakyat Indonesia sesuai hasil survei Kompas ini akan bisa benar-benar terrealisir atau akan banyak kendala di nantinya ya. Malam hari ini kita beruntung ya, we are more than happy ya to have our special guest ya, speaker from Germany. Ada Profesor Andreas Ufen ya. Beliau pakar politik Indonesia ya, demokratisasi in Southeast Asia Indonesia. Nanti akan kita dengarkan ya kira-kira analisis beliau lah tentang prospek and challenge kepemimpinan Prabowo-Gibran dalam hal demokrasi. Kemudian juga ada Ibu Irine, Hiraswari Gayatri ya dari BRIN. Beliau nanti akan share ya pandangan-pandangannya terutama tentang diplomasi ya Indonesia ya. Dan terakhir nanti ada Bapak Adib Abdushomad ya. Beliau Kepala Pusat Kerukunan Umat Beragama ya. Jadi kita memang sengaja ya pembicaranya ada juga yang orang struktural. Ya, let's say bagian dari rezim Prabowo-Gibran ya. Ada Pak Adib Abdushomad ya. Tapi saya percaya beliau kepakaran dan ininya objektivitasnya. Jadi apalagi kita akan membahas tentang prospek and challenge ya. Jadi opportunity dan mungkin kendala-kendala. Dan tentu saja analisis yang kita bahas pada malam hari ini bisa menjadi pegangan kita ya, dan juga nanti mungkin masukan buat pemerintah dan pihak-pihak terkait, terutama terkait perjalanan kepemimpinan selama 5 tahun ke depan. Saya kira begitu, tidak ingin berpanjang kata. Sekali lagi terima kasih kepada Pak Rektor. Nanti kita nantikan pengantar diskusinya yang selalu mind provoking. Kemudian juga terima kasih kepada para narasumber dan juga kepada para peserta webinar pada malam hari ini. Semoga apa yang kita bahas manfaat dan berkah, dan malam hari ini menjadi webinar yang produktif untuk kita semua. Terima kasih. Wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Selamat malam semuanya.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Suratno atas sambutannya. Selanjutnya saya berikan waktu kepada Bapak Didik untuk memberikan sedikit introduction. Silakan Pak Didik.
Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ya.
Waalaikumsalam
Good evening. Ya. I would like to thank you, very much to Professor Andreas Ufen, for having contribution to seminar led by Dr. Suratno, also Ibu Irine, Hiraswari Gayatri, from BRIN, and then also Bapak Adib, Dr. Adib Abdushomad, thank you for contributing and giving some ideas later on in this seminar. I would like to have some ideas in this introduction. In the government of Prabowo-Gibran, there is a very strong question about how to strengthen democracy in this period of Prabowo. How we have to strengthen this democracy and its institution. This is a big question because in the first step of forming the government, Prabowo tried to accommodate as many as possible and even almost all parties with his group. So only Nasdem and PKS outside the government. But actually, PKS, even this party does not send his real cadre, but they propose, a professional person to the Prabowo government, meaning that he is not really part of the opposition. Yeah. So question of the democratic institution is how check and balances, yeah, how check and balances working in this democratic system. This is the big question in the government of Prabowo-Gibran. Yeah. And the second issue, this government is about continuity of the government of Joko Widodo. Yeah. This is a part of this 5 years period will be continuing all Joko Widodo program. Yeah, but in case of IKN, yeah, maybe Prabowo will continue to think twice, yeah, about continuity of this IKN project. But almost all issues related with the industrialization or hilirisasi in Indonesian term, Prabowo will continue this program. Also, he has a new program like feeding the school, the student. Yeah, this is also good and massive program, but still questioning the people questioning about the budget. Yeah, because we have a limited budget. Yeah. And the third, there is also a tendency. There is also a question about the: is there any authoritarian tendency in the Prabowo government? Yeah, this is still a question. In the question mark, yeah, for the people, because the background of Prabowo military, the people will continue to see these issues related to the action of the government, Prabowo government. Yeah. Finally, Prabowo government has some problem in economic program. Yeah. He will expand economic growth to be 8%. This is almost impossible, yeah, for the current condition, because the largest part of the economy is industry. Our industry is going down, yeah, and then some analysts say that we have deindustrialization process. Yeah, so this will be the problem in the government of Prabowo. Yeah, I think those some issues I would like to present in this seminar. Yeah, I hope you enjoy. Thank you again, Prof. Andreas. Yeah, Ibu Irine and Pak Adib. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih, Pak Didi. Thank you very much for the introduction for tonight. And selanjutnya, sebelum saya masuk kepada sesi diskusi, saya akan memperkenalkan dulu para narasumber kita pada malam hari ini. Yang pertama adalah Profesor Andreas Ufen, dosen Universitaet-Hamburg. Beliau S1, S2, S3 semua pada bidang politik ya di Universitas Berlin, Germany untuk S1 dan S2-nya. Kemudian program S3-nya di Universitaet-Hamburg, Germany juga. Yang selanjutnya adalah Ibu Irine Hiraswari Gayatri, Ph.D. Beliau adalah peneliti Pusat Riset Politik BRIN, S1 Hubungan Internasional Universitas Jember, kemudian S2 Politics di Uppsala University, Swedia, dan S3 Politik di Monash University, Australia. Dan pembicara kita yang ketiga adalah Bapak Muhammad Adib Abdushomad, Ph.D. Beliau adalah Kepala PKUB Kemenak Pusat Kerukunan Umat Beragama, S1 di Syariah IAIN Wali Songo Semarang, S2 di Manajemen dan Kepemimpinan Flinders University Australia, dan S3 Kebijakan Publik Flinders University Australia. Demikianlah para pembicara kita pada malam hari ini. Yang pertama, saya persilahkan kepada Profesor Andreas Ufen. Good evening, Professor. The time and place is yours now.
Okay, thanks very much for this kind introduction. In Germany, it's now 1:40 p.m., so it's still quite early. I try to share my presentation. I hope you can see that now.
Yes, it is clearly. Thank you.
So like this, yeah. So I would like to talk about autocratization in Southeast Asia and democratic resilience in Indonesia. I think this is the topic Pak Didik Rahbini was also talking about, the question whether Indonesia is resilient to support those forces that are still backing democratization in Indonesia. But I will first talk a little bit about the overall background in Southeast Asia. I will define the terms autocratization and democratization. I will shortly present what kind of political systems exist in Southeast Asia and how they have evolved over the last few years. And then in the second part, I will talk more about democratic recession or democratic backsliding in Indonesia. You know, there's a broad literature on especially democratic backsliding by Fossati, Mietzner, Espinel, Fedi Hardis, and others, about at least the declining quality of democracy in Indonesia since the 2010s, more or less. And then in my conclusion, I will try to answer to an extent the question whether Indonesia is a dying democracy now under Prabowo, or whether it is resilient enough to still exist as a democracy in the near future. So I'm referring mostly to VDEM, varieties of democracy, and Lührmann and Lindberg from VDEM have differentiated between different types of autocratization. You can see it here at the bottom. So there are essentially three types of autocratization. Within the democracies, there could be democratic recession or backsliding. If you slide, for example, back from liberal democracy to electoral democracy. And then there's, of course, democratic breakdown from democracy to autocracy. And there's autocratic consolidation, like in Myanmar. Myanmar was, I would say, electoral authoritarian. And then after the coup, it was and is closed authoritarian. Examples for democratic breakdown have been, I think, India a few years ago, Thailand, and one might say also the Philippines. Why do we talk so much in political science about autocratization? I mean, there have been hundreds of articles on, even books on autocratization all over the world. And this is also according to VDEM. You can measure that there was and is an ongoing autocratization all over the world. You see, for example, on the left figure, the number of democracies, the number of liberal democracies. It's now around 30 something. It has been much more a few years ago. And there's an upsurge of autocracies over the last few years. I think it's a quite clear tendency all over the world. There are differences in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and so on, but it's a tendency that you can also observe in Southeast and South Asia. So why is there this general autocratization all over the world? maybe I have first to add that according to Luhrmann and Lindbergh, this autocratization usually does not take place in the form of military coups or of sudden breakdowns, but it is more a clandestine and a slowly processing process. For example, you would have rather a lot of new regulations that undermine democracy or that result in elections that are less fair and free. And that would mean that usually there's a slow recession of democracy or a slow autocratization, a process that is also taking place in some European countries. If you think of Hungary, for example, Hungary has evolved into a electoral autocracy over the years under Orban, but not with a military coup or something like that, but rather slowly. So what are the general factors for autocratization? I think it has a lot to do with the global political economy. The Trump factor will play a part. You have a growing nationalism and protectionism. Yeah, the maybe evolving trade war between China and the US. And you have, because of a rapid globalization, growing pressures on parts of societies all over the world, especially on the lower and middle classes, and that leads usually to backlashes and often autocratic backlashes. There's less international pressure on authoritarian regimes. Yeah, I think also because of the Trump factor, yeah, because Trump is not really interested in promoting, supporting democracy and human rights all over the world, but also because of the growing power of China, and China, to an extent, at least tries to export some ideas of autocratic leadership and things like that. And of course, you have Russia, Russia in Europe, the Ukraine war, that's the most important topic since 2022. And I think this impact of this Russian aggressive war is not, cannot be underestimated, even on politics within European countries. Because of all that, you have a polarization within civil society, also within party politics. The best example is, of course, the US, under Trump and the Democrats. But this kind of polarization takes also place in Germany and in many other European countries, and also, you could say, in Southeast Asia and also in Indonesia, not during the last election and electoral campaign, but at least from the 2010s until and including the 2019 elections. This means a global rise of populism, the Trump populism, the right-wing extremist populism we see in Germany and in many other countries, Meloni in Italy and Le Pen in France, Orban, many other countries, but also in Indonesia. I mean, the elections in 2014 and 2019 have been characterized by an upsurge of populism. And I would only say that Prabowo was the populist. I have a very narrow definition of populism. To me, Jokowi was popular, but not populist. A populist differentiates between the morally corrupt elite and the people, the rakyat, that is morally pure. And Jokowi has never done that. But Prabowo has done that in 2014 and 2019, and there were some patterns, like in the US with Trump. Prabowo would lose the elections in 2014 and 2019 and would say it was systematic corruption, systematic fraud of elections, things like that. And very important, I think, is the rise of social media, the spread of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, echo chambers, where a kind of groupism emerged. Yeah? You have different groups that only communicate within these groups. And of course, this rise of social media has made it easier for governments to use digital repression in order to control civil society. So if we look at Southeast Asian political systems and at this phenomenon of autocratization, there are still these old closed authoritarian systems like Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. Not much has changed. Okay, in Myanmar, there was this autocratization with the military coup in 2021. You have electoral authoritarian systems like Singapore, Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand. Philippines and Thailand have been electoral democracies before, but, well, there was a kind of transition towards more autocratic forms. I have to say that I'm referring all the time to VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, and their classification of political regimes: closed authoritarianism, electoral authoritarianism, electoral democratic systems, and liberal democratic systems. Electoral authoritarianism means there are elections, but the opposition has not a real chance to win. And electoral democracy, like East Timor, Malaysia, and Indonesia, means you have meaningful, all-in-all free and fair elections, but it is not a liberal democracy because of all kinds of problems. Maybe checks and balances do not really work. Maybe there's a lot of corruption, things like that. So according to VDEM, Indonesia is still an electoral democracy. Malaysia has become an electoral democracy recently. It was an electoral authoritarian system before. You have had democratic breakdowns in Thailand after the coup 2006 and 2014, but now in Thailand, the quality, not the democratic quality, but there's a kind of tentative democratization because you have meaningful, free and fair elections regarding the House of Representatives. But then there's still the Senate, where are no free and fair elections. So Thailand is authoritarian, but with some meaningful elections. And you've had autocratic consolidation in Cambodia many years ago already, in Myanmar, as I said. And Malaysia is an interesting outlier, you could say, an outlier in Southeast Asia, because it was democratized first under Mahathir after 2018, but now essentially under Anwar Ibrahim since late 2022. So I'm working a lot on Malaysia, and I'm quite optimistic when it comes to Malaysia. Maybe not that optimistic with regards to Indonesia, not like the people who took part in the Compass survey. But I'm also not very pessimistic, I would say. So there's another diagram of VDEM, where you can see the different types of regimes all over the world. CA is closed authoritarian, EA electoral authoritarian, and so on. And Indonesia is below on the left side in the gray area. Gray area means it is still an ED, electoral democracy, but ED minus, and ED minus means, well, it's still electoral democratic, but there's a potential of a democratic breakdown. So Malaysia and Indonesia are in this category, and the Philippines are already electoral authoritarian, according to VDEM. I think, of course, because of Duterte and his so-called war against drugs. So, but I will not talk more on this. but it's a very interesting overview by Wiedem. Another overview is about East Asia and the Pacific countries since 1973, and you see almost at the top Indonesia. Indonesia was, according to this, until 1998 electoral authoritarian, and then became electoral democratic, and is now this year and 2 years ago, 3 years ago, is now in this gray area. I wouldn't say that the new order Indonesia was electoral authoritarian. Some people would say that. I think it was closed authoritarian. So sometimes I have also problems with Wiedem. Okay, so as I said, there's a lot of talk about democratic backsliding in Indonesia, and I think there's indeed a backsliding. Some would say it's a myth, yeah, because the categorization of Indonesia in the late 90s, early 2000s was too good, yeah, and there was not really a backsliding, maybe a little bit only. But at least if you look at Freedom House, also quite interesting, Indonesia was free from 2005 until 2013, and afterwards it was partly free with a decreasing score. I think it was downgraded in 2014 because of this law on mass organizations, civil society organizations. According to Civicus, the civic space is obstructed, and according to the Wiedem's Liberal Democracy Index, the country is at rank 87. That's not very good. Press Freedom Index 2024 is quite bad, 111 out of 180. Maybe also too bad. I'm not always confident when looking at this Press Freedom Index. And then there's the Freedom House, Freedom on the Net Index, where Indonesia is categorized as partly free. So I think all in all, it's correct to classify Indonesia as electoral democratic and electoral democratic minus. Yeah? So, and if we look at what really happened on the ground since the 2010s, there are indeed all kinds of indicators, events that tell us that there are problems with the democratic process in Indonesia. For example, laws that have been pushed through parliament without a real debate, especially not a debate within civil society, the corruption eradication law, mining law, the omnibus law, the new capital, IKN law. You have a shrinking civic space. One reason is growing digital authoritarianism at GIGA. Yeah, I'm from University of Hamburg, but at the same time, I'm from GIGA, the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. At GIGA, we have two research projects on digital authoritarianism, digital repression in 6 Asian countries: India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And in Indonesia, I also conducted interviews with human rights activists last year. And well, there is the feeling of being threatened. There's the feeling that you cannot talk openly and communicate openly via social media. And that's, I think, a growing phenomenon in Indonesia. Then there was this weakening of the KPK and the instrumentalization of the judiciary with the decision on Gibran a few months ago. You all know that. So the question Professor Didi Grachbini also raised is, what does all that mean for the future in Indonesia? Yeah, because we have now a president with an, I would say, oligarchic backing. Yeah, I'm referring to this Jeffrey Winters, Fedi Hardis discourse on oligarchization in Indonesia. That means big entrepreneurs who have a direct impact on politics. And of course, Prabowo who once said he belongs to the elite sadar, to the conscious elite, I think is actually part of this oligarchic elite. There were some announcements by Prabowo that have shown a disdain for liberal democracy. He was a populist, at least in 2014 and 2019. I have written here with a volatile ideology. Populists base their populism on a thin ideology, and then they pick out some ideological elements to complement this. But usually it's a thin ideology. And, well, I think we can talk about that later, the global environment, the regional environment, the multiplex order according to Acharya, the China threat that also plays a role and may entail autocratic tendencies, at least. The question is Indonesia resilient? And there's also now, since a few years, a broad literature on democratic resilience, the ability of a system to withstand the autocratization, and that depends on, according to Merkel and Lührmann, to the institutional relationship between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. That means, do we have a kind of super presidentialism? Is the president able to circumvent the legislature? Is he able to staff the executive with his own people? We already heard that there's a new cabinet with more than 100 members, and everybody from almost all parties is involved in this new cabinet. So we already see that in Indonesia, there's a tendency to have, again, these grand coalitions and to include many people. So that tells us a lot about the institutional relationship. Then the second, the most relevant political actors with regards to democratic resilience are political parties. In Indonesia, you have many different parties. I mean, I could compare that with Donald Trump, yeah? Maybe that's a nice comparison, US and Indonesia. In the US, you have a very strong president who will staff the whole executive sector and maybe also the judiciary with his own people. And he can rely on the support of the legislature because he will have majorities in the Senate and probably also in the House of Representatives. So he's very strong, and the institutional relationship is very fragile in the US. There are two parties in the US, and he has the full support of the Trumpists and the Republican Party. In Indonesia, it's different. There are 8, 9 parties in parliament, and the party of Prabowo is quite small, and he has to rely on all the other parties. Yes, he has a grand coalition, but the grand coalition can only survive if he seeks compromises with all the other parties. That's totally different from the US. Third, democratic resilience is also based on citizens' attitudes and behaviors and on an active civil society. That will be interesting to see in the US. Yeah, I think there are tendencies that many people support autocratization, but also, on the other hand, you have a very active civil society and a very strong democratic party. But in Indonesia, surveys show us that most Indonesians support democracy, but I think it's a very vague notion of democracy according to these surveys. To many people, democracy means you elect and somebody decides for you, but a deeper understanding of democracy is not very much rooted within large parts of the Indonesian society, I would say. And the fourth and very fundamental factor for resilience is the so-called political community of citizens, and that means, according to Merkel and Lührmann, that the community is not very much polarized. In the US it is, so much so that I think the US democracy is very much under threat. But in Indonesia, it was for a few years at least, but now it is not. Yeah, I think there has been a kind of depolarization of Indonesian society in recent years, and that has to do, of course, with the fact that Prabowo switched to the Jokowi camp in 2019, and that there is a lot of continuity now, and yeah, a broad consensus among parties and also between the Jokowi supporters and the Prabowo supporters, and also by political Islam, I would say. So this is totally different from the US, and that is the main reason why I am rather optimistic than pessimistic with reference to Indonesia. So I would say in Indonesia, autocratization is possible, but it is unlikely because there's no major polarization at the moment. Prabowo and Jokowi are still cooperating. Prabowo wants the continuity. The radical political Islam has been sidelined because of this specific political dynamics, but also, of course, because of some autocratic measures by Jokowi a few years ago. Yeah, a good indicator of the resilience of Indonesian democracy is also that Jokowi was unable to further autocratize. He sought a third term, but he didn't get the support of all the parties in parliament. And that has happened a few times, that Jokowi had to backtrack when there was civil society resistance. Yeah? So I would think that Indonesian democracy stays resilient, that Prabowo and his cabinet will be mostly pragmatic in terms of economic and foreign policies, not much change. And I would also refer to Indonesianists Edward Espinel and Slater. Slater talked about promiscuous power sharing. Yeah, promiscuous power sharing means all these parties come always together in grand coalitions and they build a cartelization. This a whole strand of literature, and it was always very pessimistic, and it was a criticism of Indonesia. But at the same time, this could be a good factor for Indonesian democratic resilience, because if you have grand coalitions, you are forced to seek compromises, and that culture of seeking compromises may hinder autocratization in Indonesia. Thanks very much. So I have to get out here. I try.
Thank you very much, Pak Ufen, for your presentation tonight, and then we will continue to the other speaker for this evening, Ibu Irine. Kepada Ibu Irine, apakah masih bersama? Iya. Selamat malam Ibu Irine, Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Ya, saya berikan waktu dan tempat untuk Ibu Irine. Silakan untuk memberikan presentasinya malam ini.
Oke, saya akan siapkan dulu sebentar. So, good evening, everyone. And hello, Andreas. Maybe we met in 1998 or 2000. Perhaps you had visited LIPI at that moment. My office used to be called LIPI, if you remember.
Yeah, I was a few times at LIPI. Yeah, when
Yeah,
Muhammad Hikam was still at LIPI.
Yes,
Yeah?
yes, he was.
Oh.
And then Ikrar Sabakti, Professor Ikrar, Bude
Yeah.
So, okay, so, and Professor Samsudin Haris, of course, as one of the reference of the Indonesian politics. So before everything, before we start, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Didik Rahbini and my dear colleague, Dr. Suratno Mokheri, and also, of course, for Professor Andreas and Bapak Adib for this great evening. So I would like to explain some views on foreign policy, right? But particularly the diplomacy during the within 100 days of Pak Prabowo's presidency in Indonesia. So if perhaps anyone followed this morning, we had somewhat surprising situations that had developed after the first visit of 16 days trip abroad by Pak Prabowo and several of the cabinet members. But also apparently he was accompanied by several of the business sectors. And we could say that this trip is imitating the eagerness of Pak Prabowo to be one of the outstanding, to show how outstanding the leadership is. And I understand this within the perspective that, as Andreas earlier mentioned, there used to be a rift among the Indonesian community with regard on how they see the government, right? Especially since President Prabowo has quite controversial background, if we may agree on that. We won't forget, because 1998 was still there at the corner. And we...
Nggak apa-apa.
Sorry? Ada yang, sorry.
Bu Maya, tolong diam.
Enggak.
Okay, I will continue. So can everyone see my screen correctly?
Yes.
Iya, Ibu, silakan. Bisa
Okay.
terlihat. Ya.
Yeah. So if you remember the controversy surrounding Prabowo's background, and then he still got majority vote during the last election. Apparently, that doesn't affect much in the foreign policy arena. So when I listened to what Professor Andreas' explanation, and that he ended with some sort of positive reflection that the future under President Prabowo is not that bad, that confirms some of the issues that I would like to share this evening regarding his direction in the diplomacy in the foreign policy. So under Prabowo Subianto leadership, Indonesian diplomacy is poised to enter a transformative phase with potential regional and global engagement shift. And that is quite obvious since the first day of his appointed as president, he directly went on tour for 16 days. I think he just arrived in the USA as we speak now. Known for his military background and strong national stance, which is quite important for all Indonesian leaders since after independence, should have strong national stance. Prabowo's presidency may renew the focus on national sovereignty, security, and strategic alliances. So I listened for, I learned for several online discussions, but also recent analysis, podcasts, and alike from experts on Indonesian foreign policy abroad and also from Indonesia. They shared similar perspectives. This period could see Indonesia, although not yet seen clearly redefining its roles within association of Southeast Asian nations, while balancing the complex relationship with major powers like the United States and China. So these two actors, these two international state actors, is always in the lexicon of Indonesian foreign policy. But to some extent, they had pretty much relationship with Indonesia's past. Cold War legacies, to name a few, but also what happened with the image of threat from the East that is institutionalized in history books and alike. So when somebody bluntly told me that there is a China threat, to what extent this person understood what is defined as China threat? How would we define threat from China itself? So thus exploring Indonesian diplomacy under Prabowo's administration offers insights into how the nation might balance its aspiration for regional leadership with the imperatives of global diplomacy and domestic priorities. So Has mentioned that foreign policy starts at home, but we would see if this is quite fit with how our president is taking, into the foreign policy arena at the moment. So I just wanted to take, guide you historically back to our shifts in foreign policy. During Sukarno's presidency between 1945 to 1967, Indonesia pursued a radical anti-imperialist foreign policy. Sukarno advocated for the leadership of the new emerging forces, or NEFOs, against the old established forces, or ODEFOs, condemning the prevailing international system as exploitative, according to Weinstein in 1971. So scholars of international relations would know about this classic by Weinstein. And this led to confrontations with the Dutch over West Irian, or now we know as Papua, and the British in Malaysia. So Sukarno's foreign policy was characterized by militant confrontation against imperialism and focus on self-reliance, the element that we also wanted to revive these days, even withdrawing from the United Nations in 1965. And then followed the Suharto era with the backdrop of the complexities of the Cold War, a post-Cold War, and then the United States policy in Southeast Asia also affected how the new order established in the early 1970s. The Suharto period shifted towards more pragmatic approach. We remember in 1968, Indonesian government for the first time, and this law still take place now, the law on foreign investment in 1968, just 1 year after the coup, right? It shifted towards more pragmatic approach. And this is what I think, and if we reflected on several sources, somewhat epitomized during President Jokowi's administration, but also recalibrated perhaps during President Prabowo's administration. They wanted to focus on economy. So Suharto centralized foreign policy decision-making, leading to an elitist and unstructured approach, according to Julian Ingtias in 2024. But during this period, Japan's strategic interest in Indonesia focused on natural resources and direct investment, supported by official development assistance. So there is a somewhat, this is Indonesian perspective. So we want to develop our country. This is what I understood from Suharto's autobiography, but also partly Sukarno's autobiography. They imagine similar aspects. We want to develop this nation. We want to see our influence at the global fora, although to some degree Suharto's lesser, I won't call it exhibitionist, but in terms of influencing international opinion, Sukarno went ahead. But that also due to the context when he became president in 1945, what happened in Europe, what happened in Southeast Asia, what happened in Asia, colonialism, and so on and so forth, that shaped how Sukarno think about sovereignty and become an independent country in 1945. So Suharto inherited the spirit from Sukarno, but he wanted to have strategic interests in terms of development and investment. So the post-Suharto era, known as the Reformation era, we witnessed several of changes from President Habibie, freedom of the press, but also more pressures from the international monetary regime. If we remember how the mass media portrayed Suharto signing his resignation letter in front of the IMF Michael Kamdesu. And this would be an opening to discuss on whether our affair with the liberal economy and politics led us to the current situation, and how our leaders during the reform, President Habibie, President Megawati, President Gus Dur, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, in some ways had opened themselves, especially during Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono presidency, with his credo, 1,000 friends, 0 enemy, normal, localizing global norms. Like Amitav Acharya, I think Andreas also mentioned a bit, localizing global norms. I understand scholars on non-Western international relations find it perhaps erratic or idiosyncratic style on how Indonesians, government or regime want to localize global norms. But to some extent, as I had experienced firsthand on how Indonesia localizing women, peace, and security into our national norm, without that, there won't be any progress on how we intersected with the global community, especially in regard to human rights, women's rights, and so on. So the fall of Suharto created opportunities or facilitated opportunities for reform, with Indonesian diplomacy playing a more substantive role in addressing economic, political, and social challenges. No other than because we had intersectioned or interacted with several of more universal level of norms. Several of Indonesians' progressive laws were born during this period, like on freedom of the press, as I mentioned, the law of anti-racial and ethnic discrimination in 2008 was promoted by President Abdurrahman Wahid under the support, whole support from the Yayasan Lembaga Bantuan Hukum. Komnas Perempuan was born in 1999, and then it followed by 2 presidential decrees and so on. So shortly speaking, 1998 democratization opened the way for the institutionalization of the human rights and women's rights. So if you look into the 4th constitutional amendment, you would see several of important elements that reflect how the progress had started since 1998. And that also supported by how Indonesian leaders, especially during Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, opened itself with this credo, 1,000 friends, 0 enemies. Okay. So, however, in particular areas of foreign policy, such as Indonesia-China Sea diplomacy, we tend to maintain continuity dating back to the Suharto era. For instance, according to McRae in 2019, where Indonesia has positioned itself as a non-claimant state. Why Indonesia positioned itself as a non-claimant state? Because we realize there are too much at stake in ourselves, but also with regard to our neighbor countries along the 9 days lines. And under President Joko Widodo's administration, Indonesia's approach to regionalism has significantly shifted as well. Jokowi's administration has overlooked ASEAN as a multilateral organization, according to Rosidin and Patipelohi, 2020. Now, this shift attributed to the belief that Indonesia political elites and presidential advisors who argue that Indonesia should expand its focus beyond ASEAN. Yet there were some important achievement by ASEAN, for instance, with 2 aspects mainly that I followed personally on counterterrorism regulation or regional counterterrorism efforts, Ministry of Defense cooperation, but also several regional legislation regarding the women, peace, and security. And during Prabowo's presidency, some areas of continuity persist and have shown a tendency to redefine Indonesia's role in regional and global affairs, moving beyond traditional frameworks like ASEAN. So we just entered BRICS congregation, and our new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sugiono, who also graduated from Taruna Military School, likely made several statements that stressing how Indonesia wanted to partake in the new arrangement, So expectedly, he demonstrated craftsmanship, reflecting his persona as a cosmopolitan and former military. This, however, left questions on how the institutional relationship with Ministry of Foreign Affairs is arranged. Currently, our Minister of Foreign Affairs is receiving direction from the President directly. To run the office, he is aided by 3 vice ministers from senior diplomats background. And these divisions of labor reflecting how Indonesia projects the future interests with regard to how we would gain or achieve something with regard to international relations. So international relation in terms of realist perspective is more or less like that. So if we want to look back again, there are several of important principles in Indonesian foreign policy, which more or less would be renewed or maybe improvised by the current president. So maintaining sovereignty and territorial integrity, his approach aligned with the concept of state defense, which involves citizens' attitudes and actions in preserving national sovereignty. We must not forget that several months or maybe some times ago, we had this undang-undang mengenai komponen cadangan that actually ensure if any threat occur, then this is also under our Article 30 of the 1945 Constitution, the 4th Amendment, that we have this component, civilian component of reservists. But different from South Korea, this is not obligatory. Although, as for instance, civil service, we need to undergo somewhat class training before we serve. So Prabowo's strategy likely includes addressing threats to Indonesia's territorial waters and outermost islands, according to Afrianza and Fadil in 2022, as well as focusing on cyber sovereignty to combat digital vulnerabilities, according to Ruiz and Ruiz 2022 and 2023. On this aspect, Andreas mentioned earlier that there has been discussion on the shrinking civil space in the digital arena. That was quite true with the situation where Indonesia's perception on national sovereignty is seen under the threat. For instance, during the government policy in Papua, to quell the demonstration, protests, and so on and so forth, there was a engineered blackout for several regions in Papua that was that indicate how the government see itself as a threat from inside. But another thing is that despite allegation of human rights abuses, according to Tan, he secured a victory in 2024 presidential election. This raises questions, my question, about the balance between national security priorities and human rights concerns in Indonesia's approach to sovereignty. This aspect has been under discussions by many scholars, especially the constructivists, who wanted to see a balance, at least from a realist perspective, or how if we would improve or move beyond the traditional position of making friends in international relations. We need to find a balance on this matter, and we could have it in a discussion. So another goal is fostering regional stability and ASEAN unity. Indonesia foreign policies always look into this aspect. It's a central focus of its diplomatic efforts in Southeast Asia. And this objective is pursued through various strategies and initiatives within the ASEAN framework, but also outside of the ASEAN framework. A year ago, like Indonesian Civil Society Organization, ASEAN Muslim Action Network, together with ASEAN organization, sectoral bodies, and Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection, congregated in Yogyakarta to look into the women, peace, and security agenda. And in the regional sense, this is quite important because this is what unites the shared interest in improving the participation or empowerment of women in decision-making process. So Indonesia views ASEAN as the cornerstone of its foreign policy, recognizing the importance of the organization in maintaining regional peace and stability. So this is Indonesia's arena. But not all leaders think the same. As the most populous Muslim nation and is a significant regional power, Indonesia has a strategic interest in preserving Southeast Asia's autonomy and maritime security. That actually emerged this morning in response to how we had produced an MOU with the Chinese government, Republic of Tiongkok. So this is in, if we had surveyed, what you think about ASEAN, so probably this is one of the most top of the mind. We have strategic interest in preserving autonomy and maritime security in Southeast Asia. So the country's approach to regional stability is multifaceted, however, involving defense diplomacy, economic cooperation, and active participation in every ASEAN-led forum. So for instance, in the last Bali 4th Transnational Crime Forum in Bali, participated by more than 100 delegates, we discussed what aspects that would affect ASEAN member countries, but ASEAN as regional entities regarding its preventing violent extremism. And we also received delegates from Timor-Leste, aside from the status as observant of this regional organization, not yet official member. But Timor-Leste, now this is a very important aspect. Timor-Leste has been part and parcel of Indonesia's strategy in terms of ASEAN unity as well. And during our interview with Senana and Ramos Horta, with Professor Dewi Fortuna Atwar as well, and our team from BRIN on Indonesian foreign policy and gender, we learned both from Ramos Horta and Senana that actually they wanted to join ASEAN. But ASEAN is having problems, especially two countries, Singapore and I think Cambodia or Laos, with regard to capacity by Timor-Leste and readiness to be part and parcel of ASEAN as a regional organization process. So I think we need to wait to what extent Indonesian foreign policy and also role in ASEAN could influence other ASEAN membership in order to admit, the membership of Timor-Leste. Another important aspect is that Indonesian foreign policy attempts to balance relationship between United States and China to maintain regional stability, and it seeks to preserve Southeast Asia's strategic autonomy amidst the rivalry. And this balancing act is evident in efforts to strengthen ASEAN centrality and promote inclusiveness and transparency in regional affairs. These two aspects actually receive some question mark regarding, for instance, situation in Myanmar. Not to say that Indonesia had not done anything about it. And the last, not the last of this presentation, but this is the last aspect of one of the foreign policy goal in Indonesian foreign policy. So we had demonstrated several of important involvement in terms of global policy, for instance, climate change diplomacy, and also health diplomacy as instrument of foreign policy during COVID was quite obvious, although there were also abundant of critics with regard to how Indonesian government respond to COVID-19. But our minister during those period, Retno, the only and the first Indonesian minister of foreign affairs, very, very good in terms of responding to critics, but also then her role in initiating measures for vaccine equality at the 75th United Nations General Assembly that showcase its efforts to enhance regional and global stability while advancing its national interests. And in the realm of energy security, although we still have problems with our emission rate and also companies, coal and so on and so forth, Indonesia has recognized the potential of its rich mineral resources as a bargaining chip in foreign policy, amid the protest from the environmentalists, of course. However, the lack of a specialized unit dealing with energy security in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs structure indicates that this area has not yet been fully leveraged to maximize Indonesia's global influence. And this is my colleague, Professor Ganiwati Wuryandari, in her book in 2017 mentioned. And Indonesia's pro-people diplomacy under President Jokowi administration, while focusing on domestic needs, has not dismissed the country's engagement on the international stage. Instead, it has led to a stronger presence in global affairs, challenging international concerns about an inward-looking paradigm. And we will see, and we had started to see, this aspect, key themes, national resilience and independence, proactive approach in regional international diplomacy, and enhanced military and defense collaboration. We should not forget that the first, I don't remember if it is the first or some third or fifth, Prabowo's visit in Australia and also MOUs with Australian government about defense sector is quite important. And then strengthening relation with major powers, for instance, with the United States, emphasis on strategic counterterrorism, women, peace and security and defense cooperation, and also with China, economic partnership, BRI projects. We have seen how it is the response toward the light railway project. And this is one of the most important and now being under scrutiny is navigating territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And our balancing act, which really maintained to be intact, is non-alignment and independence in foreign policy, also avoiding over-reliance on any single major power, although this is also under scrutiny due to our perhaps foreign loan. Some of the question with regard to Prabowo's leadership is on this aspect, navigating conflicts with Asia, for instance, Myanmar, due to several calculations. And also how we would maintain non-interference while addressing regional issues. Non-interference principle is referring to a member state of ASEAN won't step in too much if wanted to have advice on particular shared interests, like issues on human rights, women's rights, and all of those sensitive, regarded as a sensitive topic. So characters of Pak Prabowo, more hands-on foreign policy. This I quoted from Ibu Dewi Fortuna Anmar's article in NBR. So Prabowo has demonstrated a commitment to personal diplomacy, engaging directly with world leaders to strengthen bilateral relations. Even before elected, he had received invitation from Prime Minister Xi Jinping. Notably, he embarked on a comprehensive international tour, visiting countries such as China, United States, Peru, Brazil, and the United Kingdom. This tour underscores his intent to elevate Indonesia's international standing and influence. His personal traits, former active military, cosmopolitan, likely shaped foreign policy direction. And how about the non-aligned independent stance? Right? What would be gained from that? Actually, that is to preserve Indonesia's strategic autonomy. And this has been declared ever since we became an independent state. However, a recent visit to China, followed by a joint statement, incited alarming comments from experts and a response from the Indonesian Minister of Foreign Affairs. If you click this, and I can also share this to Paramadina friends, you would see a point, I think it's point 9, that created concerns among the experts of foreign policy, but also expert of international law. So on the topic of strengthening regional leadership, actually, some expect he to adopt a more assertive role within Southeast Asia. This includes enhancing regional security cooperation and addressing shared challenges, thereby reinforcing Indonesia's position as a regional leader. Okay, how many more minutes we have? Engagement in multilateral forums, and Prabowo administration is committed to active participation in multilateral organizations. Recently, Minister of Foreign Affairs Sugiono attended BRICS, reflects Indonesia's willingness to collaboration with less traditional partners that allows it to meaningfully participate in global decision-making in process. So we don't want to be left out in deciding what could happen in international fora. It's quite obvious with Prabowo's decision to send ships to support victims of conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestina war that had sacrificed so many people. And that is also continuing what President Joko Widodo under Mr. Retno did with regard to diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy. So far, Prabowo administration also has implemented protectionist measures, such as banning certain foreign electronic products that do not meet local content requirements, according to Financial Times. And this policy aimed to boost local industries and attract foreign investment, though it has faced criticism for potentially impacting Indonesia's competitiveness. And on various occasions, he has also expressed a desire to strengthen ties with various global partners, including Russia, while maintaining a neutral foreign policy. This approach seeks to diversify Indonesia's international partnership and enhance its global influence as well. So what can we conclude from this? As Southeast Asia's largest country, Indonesia is pivotal in ASEAN stability and regional policies, and Prabowo's approach could significantly impact Indonesia's influence within ASEAN and beyond. Indonesia has a strategic location between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Prabowo's diplomatic stance could reshape Indonesia's engagement with major powers like the US and China, especially amid ongoing geopolitical tensions. Or perhaps he could create a game changer with our ascension to BRICS, for instance. Prabowo's presidency, given his military background, may emphasize defense and security in the diplomacy. Understanding this shift could provide insights into how Indonesia balances sovereignty, security, and diplomacy. And last point, but also very important, the international community closely watches Indonesia's stance on human rights. Prabowo's diplomatic strategy could affect Indonesia's global image and partnership. And I list several of references here. So anyone interested could click directly on the link. Thank you so much. And this is my email. And we could also follow in the next question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Irine. It's
Yes.
very clear explanation. And then kepada para peserta, jika ingin bertanya atau memberikan komentar, bisa silahkan menulis di kolom chat. Bisa dalam bahasa Inggris ya, in English or in bahasa Indonesia. Selanjutnya, pembicara ketiga, saya persilahkan kepada Bapak Adib untuk memberikan paparannya pada malam hari ini.
Ya, baik. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om
Waalaikumsalam.
Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, salam sejahtera. Wete Tung Tieng, good evening. Selamat malam untuk kita semuanya. Honorable Director for University of Paramadina, Bapak Profesor Dede Rahbini, kolega saya yang saya hormati dan banggakan, Bapak Suratno Ph.D, distinguished speakers, Profesor Andreas Ufen yang telah membersamai kita dan sudah presentasi, dan juga Ibu Irine dari BRIN yang sudah juga presentasi. Saya barangkali I will present my short presentation both in English and Indonesian language, just like Pak Suratno ya, gado-gado. Dan mungkin saya kira most of the participant for these seminars wants to get direct informations because you got a lot of informations and academic information, research finding from Profesor Andreas Ufen, Ibu Irene, dan juga Pak Rektor. So I will directly pointed out some key issue for this discussion, especially under my current position at the moment as the head for the religious harmony at the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, wabil khusus yang saya banggakan juga Ibu Maya Fransiska yang sebagai moderator yang baik hati. Saya paham ini tadi diulur-ulur karena saya ini posisinya sedang berada di negara Yugoslavia dulu ya, sekarang menjadi Serbia. Jadi saya tadi ada diskusi dengan Pak Dubes, beberapa diskusi juga oleh Ibu Irin juga sempat didiskusikan juga. Ada Pak Jumala di sini, Ibu Irin barangkali kenal ya. Beliau mantan Dubes yang mendiskusikan tadi yang disampaikan juga. Di Serbia ini ada sebuah joke ya, suatu ketika Pak Tito, nama lengkapnya itu dulu Presiden Yugoslavia, namanya Josip Broz Tito, itu dengan bangganya beliau mengatakan kepada Presiden Soekarno, apa yang Anda banggakan setelah nanti Anda selesai jadi presiden, warisan apa, legasinya apa? Pak Tito Presiden mengatakan, saya punya tentara yang kuat, saya punya alat-alat militer yang sangat kuat. Tapi what we can see at the moment, kita melihat justru Yugoslavia ini terpecah belah menjadi beberapa negara. Dan Bapak Presiden kita, founding fathers kita saat itu, Bapak Presiden Soekarno mengatakan, apa yang Anda wariskan? Beliau menjawab adalah ideologi Pancasila yang mempersatukan bangsa Indonesia. Alhamdulillah sampai detik ini bangsa Indonesia tetap rukun, tetap bersatu, dan kita juga lah harus menjaga dan merawat bangsa kita yang kita cintai, negara kesatuan Republik Indonesia. Baik, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, ini kan saya suruh berbicara aspek leadership current President and Vice President ya, terkait dengan bagaimana policy beliau-beliau terkait dengan kerukunan gitu ya. Nah, mari kita lihat dari slide selanjutnya itu adalah terkait dengan saya sudah sharing belum ya? Saya masalah disable ini yang nggak bisa sharing screen ya. Jadi saya sampaikan adanya astacita dan nawacita. Sudah bisa ya?
Sudah saya sharing. Mungkin bisa dilihat ya teman-teman.
Oh iya, ya. Terima kasih Ibu moderator yang baik hati. Nah, kalau kita dilihat dari astacita Bapak Prabowo, sangat tegas sekali beliau mengatakan di astacitanya sangat concern terkait dengan bagaimana merawat harmoni dan kerukunan gitu ya. Kita lihat dari misi RPJN-nya, kemudian juga arah kebijakan, kemudian indikator dan arah kebijakan. Saya ingin mengatakan bahwa astacita atau janji Presiden nomor 8 yakni memperkuat penyelarasan kehidupan yang harmonis dengan lingkungan, alam, dan budaya, serta peningkatan toleransi antar umat beragama di bawah Presiden Pak Prabowo dan Gibran. Saya optimis beliau sangat concern untuk menjaga keutuhan bangsa ini dengan pendekatan ini. Dan itu beliau buktikan dengan adanya UKP, ya, utusan khusus Presiden dalam bidang KUB, kerukunan umat beragama. Kebetulan seminggu yang lalu utusan tersebut pertama kalinya keluar kantor, namanya Gus Miftah ya, satu forum dengan saya di konsolidasi nasional untuk penguatan kerukunan umat beragama. Nah, ini saya kira sesuatu yang tentu kita harus optimis ya, bahwa beliau sangat concern untuk merawat kerukunan umat beragama. Nah, selanjutnya yang ingin saya sampaikan ini keragaman data ya, data yang Di slide selanjutnya adalah data-data tentang umat beragama di Indonesia, dan juga saya langsung aja mengaitkan beberapa isu terkait dengan hal-hal penting yang akan menjadi concern dan juga perhatian dari Bapak Prabowo, karena saat ini terkait dengan perawatan kerukunan umat beragama, kita masih merujuk kepada peraturan bersama Menteri Agama dengan Mendagri tahun 2006 nomor 9 dan 8. Nah, sudah ada Perpres PKUB yang sudah lama dibahas ya, dan sangat diharapkan sekali Bapak Prabowo dan juga Bapak Wakil Presiden Bapak Gibran ini segera untuk menaikkan dari PPM menjadi Perpres yang sudah diharmonisasi atau persetujuan harmonisasinya per bulan Agustus tahun 2024 itu sudah keluar dari Kemenkumham. Saat itu masih gabung ya, belum bisa pisah. Sehingga kalau nanti Perpres terkait dengan perawatan kerukunan umat beragama ini disahkan oleh Presiden, ini akan menjadi legacy dan sekaligus menegaskan betapa beliau Bapak Presiden Prabowo dan Gibran ini sangat serius untuk menangani isu-isu terkait umat beragama. Antara lain isu yang sangat sensitif yang saya sampaikan langsung aja di slide 5, karena saya tahu mungkin sebagian juga teman-teman lebih suka pada diskusi ya. Silakan Mbak Moderator, ya itu adalah terkait pendirian rumah ibadah. Ini sangat sensitif sekali. Kemudian politisasi agama, ya, jadi menjadikan agama sebagai alat-alat tujuan politik jangka pendek. Nah, ini kan kita pilkada serentak bulan November di beberapa daerah sudah sangat kentara sekali ya. Agama dieksploitasi sedemikian rupa untuk kepentingan-kepentingan jangka pendek tanpa mempedulikan dampak dari politisasi agama ini untuk kerukunan dan keutuhan bangsa ini. Yang ketiga adalah potensi konflik sosial disebabkan isu sara. Kemudian ujaran kebencian atau sara hate speech melalui media, apalagi sekarang kan era IoT, Internet of Things, ya ini juga selaras dengan adanya berita bohong, hoak ya, dan yang lain sebagainya. Ini hal-hal yang harus disikapi, dan kami telah melakukan beberapa antisipasi. Untuk slide selanjutnya, yaitu kita punya KMA 332 tahun 2023. Yaitu deteksi dini konflik berdimensi sosial keagamaan. Bahkan sebulan yang lalu ada KMA 924, yaitu penguatan panitia pusat terkait dengan deteksi dini konflik berdimensi sosial keagamaan. Nah, ini dalam rangka untuk memberikan respon cepat jadi terhadap potensi-potensi konflik yang kan kita meyakini tidak ada konflik agama. Yang ada itu adalah konflik yang berdimensi keagamaan, yang dinisbatkan ke agama. Karena setiap agama tentunya mengajarkan kebaikan, mengajarkan kedamaian. Nah, dalam rangka itu semuanya terkait dengan ini juga komitmen pemerintah adalah untuk menciptakan merawat kerukunan adalah Perpres 58 tahun 2023, yaitu penguatan moderasi beragama, strengthening religious moderation, dan ini Kementerian Agama sebagai sekretaris bersamanya atau yang mengorkestrasi. Dan alhamdulillah tidak saja dengan adanya Perpres ini, akhirnya moderasi beragama juga menjadi program-program di lintas KL. Hasilnya sangat signifikan. Kita lihat dengan adanya penguatan MB, indeks kerukunan umat beragama kita naik ya tahun 2023, yaitu 7602, tahun 2024 ini 76,47. Ini yang melakukan adalah dari Badan Litbang ya, Kementerian Agama. Nah, selanjutnya mimpi-mimpi yang ingin disampaikan oleh pimpinan kita yang kemarin disampaikan oleh Gus Miftah, dan juga saya amplifikasi juga saat saya pertama kali diberikan amanah ini, yaitu melalui PKUB kita ingin sekali menjadikan bangsa Indonesia yang kita cintai ini menjadi referensi dan destinasi dunia terkait dengan kerukunan umat beragama. Termasuk pada kesempatan ini kami diminta presentasi tokoh-tokoh akademisi dari lintas agama, dari Hindu, Buddha, Islam, untuk berbicara interfaith dialog, sekaligus mereka ingin tahu, ingin belajar, ingin juga melihat bagaimana Indonesia yang beraneka ragam bisa rukun, bisa luar biasa, punya alat rekat yang kemudian mereka kalau lihat flashback sejarah yang tadi saya ungkapkan itu, Kita punya ideologi Pancasila, kita punya banyak sekali tools-tool yang menjadikan alhamdulillah bangsa kita, bangsa Indonesia ini meskipun beraneka ragam suku, budaya dan bangsanya bisa dipersatukan dalam bingkai negara kesatuan Republik Indonesia. Saya kira poin-poin itu yang ingin saya sampaikan. I'll be more than happy to have further discussion. Waktunya juga cukup malam dan malam ini ada undangan lagi kita keluar Pak Suratno. Jadi saya mohon maaf kalau ini comeback. Saya juga tadi buru-buru ya untuk menyelamatkan ini semuanya. Ini peta jalan biasa aja. Artinya ini bagian dari ikhtiar bagaimana supaya terjadi penguatan kerukunan umat beragama di Indonesia. Saya menyambut baik diskusi ini, semoga sangat bermanfaat. Terima kasih para narasumber yang lain. Let's contributing to peace together for our beloved nation, Indonesian nation country. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Adib presentasinya walaupun singkat ya. Untuk materi presentasi mungkin nanti akan saya berikan melalui kolom chat jika teman-teman ada yang membutuhkan gitu. Di sini sudah ada pertanyaan dari sebentar saya lihat untuk Pak Andreas Ufen. Ya, kita buka saja diskusi ya berhubung sudah selesai Pak Adib dengan presentasinya. Artinya ketiga pembicara sudah selesai memaparkan presentasinya masing-masing. Pertanyaan pertama kepada Pak Ufen. There is a question for you, Pak Ufen.
Yeah, I've seen there are two questions for me. Yeah, so one is on environmental policy. Yeah,
you understood already.
Kekerasan terhadap lingkungan.
Yeah, in the concept of democracy, in fact, we saw that more violence within the society nowadays. Democracy seems used as a validation to implement privatization of natural resources, which could be detrimental for the local society. So, could you give your opinion about this? Are you following?
Yeah, whether there is a direct connection, democracy, democratization, I don't see a direct relationship. I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see a direct relationship. I mean, privatizations are in autocratic systems and in democratic systems. But what you usually have in democratic systems is that there are checks and balances, yeah, and that means that privatization is much more controlled by civil society and has to be legitimated by majorities, and it has to go through parliaments. It is much more regulated, I would say. And what you see in Indonesia is that you have oligarchs. Oligarchs control political parties, and then they are able to privatize or to invest in, especially in local communities without much resistance. I think this kind of connection is there. I would say the more democratic a polity, the more checks and balances you have, and the more difficult it is for big companies to invest in certain areas or certain sectors of the economy. I think this is also related to the other question. Yeah. Are there less foreign investments in backsliding countries, for example? Is there a connection between foreign investments and the type of political system? And yes, there is. For example, in China, People's Republic of China, European and American companies have invested billions and trillions of US dollars. But now I'm speaking of European companies and also German companies, for example, they divest. They now try to redirect their investments from China to other countries, especially to Southeast Asia, to Malaysia, and now increasingly to Indonesia, I would say, because of the trade war. that will start again, I think, between the US and China. And also because of the Russia impact, because many German companies had invested in Russia, but then came the war, and then they had to redirect everything. Or many or parts of these companies were lost because of the war by Russia against Ukraine. So I think foreign investors like to invest in countries that are politically stable, but at the same time countries that are not aggressively fighting against other countries or are involved in trade wars. So nowadays, German, European companies would not like to invest, of course, in Russia, but also not in the People's Republic of China, but they are looking to reorient their investments to politically stable countries, preferably democratic, but they don't have to be democratic because a lot of investments now also go to Vietnam. Vietnam is closed authoritarian, but it is politically very stable. So this is the connection, I would say, between foreign investments and the type of political system, and also the type of foreign policy a country pursues.
Okay, thank you. I think you already answered too for the question number 2.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And then kepada Ibu Irine, sepertinya ada pertanyaan juga. Bagaimana masa depan dukungan Indonesia kepada Palestina? Apakah akan sebaik kemarin atau lebih baik gitu? Atau mungkin menurun? Bagaimana menurut pendapat Bu Irine?
Ya, itu benar, pertanyaan yang penting ya. Kemarin waktu berpidato ketika beliau baru dilantik, itu salah satu yang membawa makan waktu itu bicara mengenai Palestina. Dan dalam sejarah kepemimpinan Republik Indonesia, bahkan di buku Soekarno yang beberapa jilid itu, termasuk partai-partai politik tahun 1950-an, solidaritas terhadap perjuangan rakyat Palestina itu selalu menjadi hal penting. Nah, sementara Indonesia memang sudah sejak lama, termasuk Indonesia, buka kedutaan besar di Palestina pada tahun 1990. Jadi secara simbolis dan juga secara faktual, memang akan mendapatkan tempat yang sangat penting. Nah, persoalannya adalah to what extent atau seberapa jauh itu nanti diartikulasikan dalam bentuk yang nyata. Nah, kalau deklarasi statement sudah pasti, tidak ada keraguan-raguan. Tapi misalnya seperti kemarin beliau menyumbang bantuan humanitarian, mengirim kapal, dan juga mungkin ada waktu itu kalau tidak salah ada usulan untuk peacekeeping dari Indonesia masuk ke sana dan lain sebagainya. Itu sebetulnya hanya indikasi bahwa Palestina akan mendapatkan tempat penting. Nah, hal lain adalah diplomasi. Sejauh mana sebetulnya Indonesia akan melanjutkan diplomasi yang keliling dengan negara-negara sahabat, termasuk dari OIC, International Islamic Organization, untuk bisa memengaruhi aktor-aktor penting yang terlibat secara diametral. Satu, apakah melalui lobby dengan Amerika, melobi China juga, dan juga langsung lewat negara-negara Timur Tengah. Jadi diplomasinya akan tetap ada pada dua arah. Tapi yang terpenting adalah national sentiment secara sosiologis dan kultural. Indonesia tuh bisa dikatakan mungkin 75% atau 80% mendukung kemerdekaan Palestina. Dan tahun 2021, saya lupa tahun berapa, itu bisa disaksikan pada periode setahunan yang lalu ya, ketika jutaan mungkin dari semua kota turun ke jalan merespon tindakan balasan Israel terhadap serangan Hamas pada 7 Oktober 2023 dan hampir setahun. Setelah itu eskalasinya meningkat. Indonesia juga tidak menutup mata sebetulnya bahwa beberapa international partner termasuk strategic partner mempunyai peran yang besar. Nah, dalam kaitan itu mungkin kunjungan Prabowo ke Amerika itu salah satunya juga bisa membuka peluang untuk memberikan sinyal bahwa it has to stop, or if you could affect Israel to stop doing what they're doing. And I think this is very important. Harapan yang sama sebenarnya dulu diberikan kepada Jokowi ketika beliau melakukan kunjungan ke Amerika Serikat. Namun kemudian Amerika keburu pemilu dan lain sebagainya. Dan lobby Israel juga masih sangat kuat. Tapi jika kemudian indikasinya adalah pidato kemarin ketika beliau dilantik, hal yang pertama disinggung adalah Palestina, dan juga masih merupakan negara terbesar di UKI, pasti saya pikir tidak akan diragukan bahwa komitmen dan juga tindakan konkret ke Palestina masih akan dilakukan. Nah, justru sebenarnya kalau ada penurunan, justru publik bisa mempertanyakan apakah lewat parlemen atau lewat forum-forum yang memungkinkan. Karena misalnya ada Pak Fadlizon di kebudayaan, gitu. Beliau juga salah satu orang yang sangat konsisten. Jadi, dan dari partai pendukung sendiri, termasuk PKS terutama, dan PKB, mempunyai garis politik luar negeri atau perspektif politik luar negeri yang mendukung upaya mendorong kemerdekaan Palestina dan juga penghentian kekerasan di sana. Semoga itu jawabannya bisa mendukung ya. Meskipun kemarin sebetulnya ada kekhawatiran juga, oh kita bisa dekat-dekat ke Israel nih gara-gara kita juga punya bisnis community kan. Although we don't have diplomatic relation. Demikian, Mbak Moderator.
Baik ya, sepertinya memang masih ada keraguan-raguan ya bagaimana nanti Indonesia ke depannya dukungan terhadap Palestina ya, seperti yang tadi Ibu bilang, bagaimanapun kita tetap masih ada hubungan dengan Israel dalam kerjasama-kerjasama tertentu, walaupun secara eksplisit tidak ada maksudnya tidak ada bahasanya perjanjian yang ini ya secara politik ya, Mas.
Saya tidak bilang ragu-ragu ya, Mbak. Saya bilang bahwa akan ada kemungkinan-kemungkinan yang mungkin bisa diperkuat. Tapi saya tidak bilang ragu.
Ya.
Karena sejak awal statementnya Pak Prabowo ketika dia dilantik, yang pertama disebut adalah soal mendukung kemerdekaan Palestina. Jadi dari sisi political commitment mungkin bisa lebih keras. Tapi to what extent itu yang kita perlu lihat. Jadi tidak ada statement saya katakan ragu-ragu. Koreksi sedikit. Terima kasih.
Ya. Baik, dengan demikian lebih jelas nih gitu bagi teman-teman mungkin yang kira-kira bertanya bagaimana nih dukungan ke Palestina ke depannya gitu. Baiklah teman-teman yang lain mungkin ada yang ingin bertanya lebih lanjut atau ada yang memberikan komentar gitu, boleh silahkan langsung raise hands atau buka mic-nya atau bisa juga menuliskannya dalam kolom chat. Silahkan. Jadi Pak Suratno mungkin ada tambahan atau
terima kasih Pak sebelum Bu Maya ya.
Baik Pak.
Belum ada pertanyaan yang lain ya. Mumpung ada pakatnya Irine ya. Saya mungkin mau tanya Bu Irine bagaimana terutama isu-isu yang terkait hak asasi manusia ya. Karena ya itu very well known lah Pak Prabowo kan sering ya dikait-kaitkan dengan isu pelanggaran HAM ya. Jadi bagaimana prospek itu ya terutama yang terkait dengan international diplomasi ya. Karena kan misalnya ya KKB ya di Papua rame ya dan beberapa hal yang lain gitu. Mungkin itu dulu Bu Irine sambil nunggu pertanyaan yang lain. Terima kasih.
Iya, itu topik yang sangat menarik sekali ya. Kalau pendekatannya Pak Jokowi ke Papua itu kan pembangunan, sudah hampir 100% itu pembangunan sama pendekatan militer. Dan dengan dibikin IKN itu ada pemusatan pasukan juga di Kalimantan yang siap diturunkan sewaktu-waktu ada persoalan di sana. Tapi pendekatan ini belum akan berubah di bawah Pak Prabowo. Bahkan terakhir, setelah kebetulan saya di Papua Selatan, setelah saya selesai dari debat pilkada Papua Selatan, Pak Prabowo dan tim datang ke sana untuk mengecek persiapan sawah 2 juta hektar itu kalau tidak salah. Jadi memang orientasinya tetap engaging, membalikan yang pro Papua Merdeka misalnya untuk tetap mendukung Republik, tetapi juga di sisi lain tetap menjalankan agenda pembangunan. Nah ini yang kemungkinan besar tetap akan menuai protes. Menurut saya memang selalu ada perbedaan dalam cara pandang mengenai Papua, indigenous rights dan juga self of determination. Kita pernah mengalami itu juga di Timor Leste. Nah, tampaknya kalau pendekatan apalagi presidennya dari kalangan nasionalis, tentu dia tidak akan ingin melakukan periode seperti itu. Tetapi yang perlu menjadi perhatian adalah konsensusnya orang Indonesia itu rata-rata tidak ingin melihat Papua merdeka dari Indonesia. Di sisi lain, kita ingin melihat sejauh mana sebenarnya pemerintah bisa improve dengan persoalan pemenuhan hak-hak asasi manusia di sana. Termasuk misalnya tidak ada lagi kekerasan, tidak ada deliberative arrest, kemudian juga ketersediaan dan sensitivitas untuk melakukan pembangunan di sana dengan memperhatikan keseimbangan antara akses dari masyarakat adat dan lain sebagainya. Diplomasi tentang Papua sendiri memang condong kepada defense, ya, defense diplomasi dengan mengedepankan apa yang sudah dan konkret serta tuntas dilakukan di dalam negeri. Ini saya mengutip Ambasador Abdul Qadir Jailani pada sebuah diskusi. Frontliners di foreign policy itu menjawab berbagai pertanyaan mengenai Papua. Tetapi seberapa jauh dalam level national policy bisa diselesaikan atau bisa diatasi atau bisa diimprove, itu akan menjadi faktor bagaimana artikulasi respon dalam konteks foreign policy. Walaupun sebetulnya regardless ya, kita bisa lihat misalnya berapa kepemilikan international companies di Papua termasuk yang sudah plotting untuk investing program strategik nasional itu juga termasuk beberapa negara barat. Jadi artinya regardless apa yang terjadi, investasi tetap akan masuk. Nah, persoalannya kan kita mau merespon seperti apa mengenai kecenderungan pelanggaran HAM dan seperti apa pelanggaran HAM ini kemudian bisa diurus oleh Pak Menteri Natalis Pigai misalnya. Itu yang saya kira selain masyarakat sipil, DPR juga sebenarnya harus punya gigi di sini. Komisi 1 terutama. Karena Komisi 1 lah yang melantik dan mengurusi masalah-masalah politik dalam negeri dan luar negeri kan. Jadi pertanyaannya bisa ditujukan ke Pak Natalius. Pak, strategi Bapak apa nih? Gitu. Menurut saya, apalagi beliau kan orang Papua. Diharapkan emiknya bisa berkontribusi pada bentuk-bentuk kebijakan pemerintah untuk mendekati situasi di Papua. Kita lihat saja dalam waktu 100 hari ke depan. Gitu Mas Suratno. Semoga cukup memberi gambarannya. Kalau tentu saja sih saya pikir secara umum ya, aksi-aksi Kamisan itu masih bisa berlangsung. Saya sangat berterima kasih. Karena memang itu harus berlangsung. Jadi di sisi lain ada persekusi, masih ada represi, meskipun tidak dalam skala seperti pre-1998 ya. Aktor-aktor pro-demokrasi juga ada di pemerintahan. Beberapa dari kita sudah pasti punya jalur langsung pada mereka. Nah itu jalur lain. Civil society ada pressures. Parlemen yang berdaya. Nah ini kalau Pak Andreas tadi agak pesimis mungkin soal parlemen. To what extent they can work, supervising executive. Normalnya ya kan. Karena kok semuanya kayaknya kawan nih. Gitu. One of the biggest front ya, allies. Semua kawan, tidak ada oposisi. Apakah ini baik atau enggak gitu loh untuk exercising beberapa hal. Itu yang justru saya ingin ketahui. Kalau enggak kan ya susah juga kita. Setiap hari harus prosedur, setiap hari harus protes gitu. Gitu Mas dan Mbak Fransiska.
Terima kasih Bu Irine. Bu Maya, satu lagi boleh sebelum pertanyaan di chat. untuk
Ah
Pak.
iya,
Pak
silakan
Andreas,
Pak.
interesting to your presentation, especially about Malaysia, because you mentioned that Malaysia, let's say, in the process of democratization, meanwhile Indonesia, what is it, has a problem with democracy. But my Malaysian fellow, mostly they will say that, oh, Indonesia is more democratic than Malaysia, especially regarding freedom of expression, freedom of speech, etc., etc. So I am a little bit surprised to see that, yeah, you mentioned about Malaysia in the process of democratization, instead of having a problem of democratization like Indonesia nowadays. Could you explain more about the current situation in Malaysia?
No. I only want to say that there's also a question to Pa Adib, but okay, I can answer very quickly. No, I think that the situation in Malaysia is not so bad now under Anwar Ibrahim since late 2022 after the elections. The elections were free and fair. Anwar won. And because it's a multi-party coalition, a Reformasi coalition, you could say, I think they are slowly progressing. But yes, there are many defects of the very young democracy of Malaysia. But I think the ability to further democratize is better than in Indonesia. There's a lively press. Yeah? There are different channels to communicate, and there's a less a government that is less inclined to suppress civil society in Malaysia these days, I would say, because yeah, you have very complex party systems, and the political parties are much more responsive than those in Indonesia, I would say. But I would leave it like that.
Okay, thank you,
Well,
Pak Andreas. Yeah.
thank you Pak Ufen, ya, Ibu Irine. Selanjutnya sebetulnya ada pertanyaan nih buat Pak Adib. Tapi Pak Adib kan sudah meninggalkan ruangan nih Pak Suratno.
Masih ada itu?
Oh, masih ada di bawah.
Masih join?
Iya, untuk oh masih ada.
Iya, gimana
Oh ya,
Bu?
baik. Saya pikir tadi
Iya.
mengundurkan diri.
Iya.
Di sini ada menarik mengenai upaya pemerintah saat ini dalam memelihara kerukunan umat beragama. Namun baik sengaja atau tidak, pemecahan justru terjadi dan diawali dari beberapa elit politik, termasuk elit politik yang sekarang mengisi pemerintahan ketika mereka bertarung dalam pemilu Indonesia. Adakah upaya pemerintah saat ini untuk menyusun aturan yang lebih mengikat terkait pelaksanaan agenda politik, khususnya mengenai politik identitas, mengingat polarisasi selalu terjadi di tahun politik atau tahun transisi pemerintahan? Bagaimana menurut Pak Adib?
Ya, baik. Terima kasih. Kita beruntung sekali memiliki beberapa jaringan-jaringan tokoh agama untuk bersama-sama menjaga negara kesatuan Republik Indonesia. Jadi upaya perawatan kerukunan umat beragama ini tidak saja tanggung jawab, it's not only the responsible for the central government, local government, but also the civil society in itself ya. Jadi merawat kerukunan umat beragama ini tidak saja tanggung jawab pemerintah pusat, pemerintah daerah, tetapi kita ya warga gitu ya. Nah, tapi kemudian tadi ditanyakan justru kadang-kadang elit-elit politik itulah yang justru merusak, kira-kira begitu ya. Yang seharusnya
Jadi
mereka ngasih
penyebab.
role model, iya. Jadi mereka nggak peduli ya. Itu saya kira memang menjadi PR. Ada orang-orang yang apa namanya? Kalau dalam sebuah pemilihan kata Pak Suratno itu ada namanya ayat-ayat kursi. Kalau kursinya udah didapatkan, ayatnya dilupakan gitu katanya. Pak Andreas Ufen itu some people try to be the candidate for the political party. They use the religious terminology. In Islam, we refers to the first so-called ayat kursi ya, the first of the kursi. Once they got the kursi, I mean the position, then they forget about the first in itself ya. Itulah kemudian masyarakat harus dicerdaskan bahwa cara kerja orang berpolitik itu sangat jangka pendek. They have the short destination, itu kekuasaan. Kadang-kadang melupakan, bahkan tidak saja melupakan, mereka they don't care about the implication for our nation state ya, kerukunan itu sendiri. Nah, memang kita dari beberapa daerah sedang menggerakkan forum kerukunan umat beragama. Pada sebelum bulan November, September, Oktober sudah sangat gencar, ada namanya deklarasi damai. Jadi kita meminta mereka bersama-sama bekerja sama dengan Kanwil, kemudian di forum kerukunan umat beragama ini didirikan oleh para tokoh-tokoh agama ya yang berada di kabupaten, di provinsi, yang kemudian mereka lintas agama juga, mereka deklarasi damai bareng-bareng dan memberikan pencerahan kepada masyarakat meskipun berbeda pilihannya tetap bersatu. Kemudian juga memberikan pencerahan agar tidak mengeksploitasi agama untuk tujuan politik jangka pendek. Nah, saya kira itu yang upaya-upaya yang telah dilakukan dan FKUB ini kalau nanti Perpres-nya itu ditandatangani oleh Bapak Presiden Prabowo dan saya sangat optimis beliau akan segera tanda tangani itu, maka akan ada FKUB nasional dan itu akan memudahkan kita untuk mengkonsolidasikan terkait tadi upaya-upaya pemerintah untuk deteksi early warning system ya, deteksi dini konflik berdimensi sosial keagamaan. Kita jejaringnya sudah ada FKUB, di Kanwil itu ada KUB, kemudian ada masyarakat civil society yang sangat peduli ya dengan NGO macam-macam, kita bersama-sama jaga ini dan memang mimpinya kita sangat ingin sekali ya Timur Tengah, bangsa dunia itu belajar ke Indonesia bagaimana kita mampu merawat kerukunan umat beragama dengan beraneka ragamnya. Dan ini kekuatannya sangat luar biasa. Kita punya ideologi Pancasila yang tidak dimiliki bangsa manapun ya. Kita ada 6 agama, banyak kepercayaan, banyak suku, bahasa dan seterusnya, tapi bisa bersatu dan kita harus syukuri ini di Serbia ini. Saya kira mukadimah yang introduction yang saya sampaikan itu ternyata cerita nyata yang tadi disampaikan bahwa ternyata yang dibanggakan alat tentara, alat yang canggih itu tidak bisa mempersatukan bangsa. Justru kita ideologi Pancasila bisa mempersatukan kita hingga saat ini. Mari kita rawat bersama-sama. Let's contributing to peace together. Saya kira begitu, Mbak Moderator dan Mas Suratno. Itu Mas Suratno sebagai pembicara nggak boleh bertanya dong, masa ikut bertanya.
Untuk
Ya,
mengisi
makasih.
waktu tadi, Pak.
Sambil
Iya.
menunggu pertanyaan.
Iya, untuk
Iya.
Baik,
Ya,
terima kasih
keren.
Pak Adib.
Acaranya keren. Ya.
Terima kasih banyak responsnya, jawabannya sangat jelas sekali ya. Kalau menurut saya, mungkin bagi teman-teman juga demikian. Selanjutnya masih ada pertanyaan. This is for Pak Ufen. Di sini is the social and political issues could be big impact for the investment in Indonesia. How do you think?
Yeah, I try to understand the logic of the question. Does it imply that democratization is not good for investments, or is it the case that elections hinder?
Especially is the case of the election, because every election will cause the social and political issues automatically in the society. So the condition.
Okay, maybe it is about political instability.
Yeah, instability. Yeah, I mean like that.
Okay. No,
Especially during the election, before and after.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, but I mean, what other option would you have? No elections? I think elections are very important for democracies. And the other question would be, would you like to scrap direct local elections? Maybe this is the idea behind it. That's what Prabowo wanted to do a few years ago, I think in 2014, no direct local elections because it's more stable and it's very costly and so on. No, I think the direct, especially the direct local elections are very important, and all in all, it was good to introduce improved democratic quality. Only because of these direct local elections, Jokowi could become governor and then president. I think that's the only way maybe to undermine the dominance of the oligarchies. Yeah, okay, that did not really happen at the national level, and you also have revived local oligarchies, but I don't see another option. I think even that democracy should be deepened at the local level. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. Coba kita lihat lagi di sini ada pertanyaan lagi. Thank you Pak Ufen. Selanjutnya di sini ada pertanyaan lagi untuk Ibu.
Last question Bu Maya, last question
Iya.
langsung dibacain aja dua-duanya.
Oke. Mengingat pentingnya stabilitas ekonomi makro untuk menjaga stabilitas politik di Indonesia, bagaimana ancaman deflasi dapat mengganggu stabilitas tersebut? Apakah strategi yang paling efektif untuk mencegah atau mengatasi deflasi sambil tetap menjaga pertumbuhan ekonomi? Kemudian selanjutnya, in my personal opinion, in Indonesia citizen who has participated in, I recognize that the transition from President Jokowi administration to President Prabowo has been notably smoother compared to 2014. It is more constructive and for the public to support the government through critical oversight of its performance and initiatives, rather than revisiting historical issues like those of 1998. We need to contribute to monitoring and safeguarding our motherland to ensure progress and accountability, despite being in its early days. The current administration proactive steps to address significant challenges such as corruption and online gambling are noteworthy. Managing a nation as a large and culturally diverse as Indonesia is inherently complex, and these efforts merit acknowledgement. Thank you. Are you follow, Ms. Ufen?
Maybe last question. First is about economic growth. Yeah, I mean, under you said democratic recession in Indonesia. Is it an utopia or not about economic growth from Prabowo-Gibran leadership? 8% in a year, etc.
Yeah.
Under the democratic recession.
Yang pertama ya, iya. Ibu Irine sudah ini ya, Pak Sur.
Maybe last question, Pak.
To me, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I think 8% are of course not possible, but well, that's politics. That's what politicians do. But if they reach 5 to 6%, that would also be very good. But I think that the IKN is not a very good idea, and also these free meals. Generally, yes, I'm very much supporting social policies, but I think it's not very good focused. I think if you spend how much, 30 billion US dollars, you should have many different projects and know exactly who gets the money, and there should be a give and take, and then it's a good investment. But just to give this kind of meal to millions of people, and I think it will end up in corruption and in not a very wise form of spending public money.
Okay. Kira-kira sudah terjawab semua ya Pak Suratno?
Sudah.
Ya, baiklah Pak Ufen, thank you very much again for your presentation for today. It is nice to meet you. Dan teman-teman semua, para peserta, juga Pak Suratno ya, selamat malam. Saya mengucapkan terima kasih banyak atas perhatiannya. Sekedar sedikit kesimpulan sebelum saya menutup acara ini adalah yang pertama tadi, presentasi dari Pak Ufen itu berbicara tentang autocratization. Jadi ketika penguasa menggunakan hukum untuk memperkuat posisi mereka yang seringkali memang mengorbankan prinsip-prinsip demokrasi dan konstitusi. Secara umum, politik di Asia Tenggara bisa dikatakan ya mendekati sistem autocratization ini, atau kita kenalnya dengan sistem otoriter, bukan dalam arti militer, tetapi dalam kebijakan-kebijakan politiknya. Termasuk di Indonesia juga sudah mendekati itu kalau menurut Pak Ufen. Kemudian beberapa indikasi dari kemunduran demokrasi Indonesia adalah pada masa pemerintahan sebelumnya, yaitu Pak Jokowi, itu adalah implementasi yang belum baik ya terkait upaya penegakan hukum tentang korupsi, omnibus law, dan lain-lain. Dan selanjutnya dari Ibu Irine itu berbicara mengenai banyak hal, perbandingan antara presiden sebelumnya dari mulai Soekarno hingga presiden terbaru kita sekarang. Cuma saya akan menggarisbawahi tentang kebijakan nasional dan internasional Pak Prabowo yang sekarang ini sepertinya akan menjadi lebih difokuskan gitu, berbeda dari presiden yang sebelumnya yang mungkin hanya berfokus pada regional saja. Tetapi di sini Pak Prabowo berusaha untuk sangat terlihat ya usahanya karena latar belakang militernya yang cukup baik ya di masa sebelum-sebelumnya dan sangat berpengaruh di ASEAN, sehingga his ability could be balance the relationship between Chinese and US too. Jadi secara internasional mungkin Indonesia sekarang akan lebih berperan ya dibanding sebelumnya. Kemudian dari Pak Adib itu merawat kerukunan beragama di Indonesia, seperti tadi sudah dijelaskan bahwa memang kondisi dewasa ini kebanyakan adalah dari sisi politikusnya ya, dari sisi pemimpin-pemimpin yang kadang-kadang lupa gitu terhadap bagaimana untuk menjaga norma dan kerukunan beragama di dalam masyarakat gitu. Dan karena itu dari Pak Adib tadi menjelaskan bahwa dari khususnya bidang yang dia tangani adalah berusaha untuk membuat pendidikan ya kepada masyarakat melalui ulama-ulama setempat untuk bagaimana caranya agar tidak terprovokasi, ya, pendeknya seperti itu, agar bisa tetap menjaga kerukunan beragama di dalam masyarakat. Kira-kira itu yang bisa saya simpulkan. Terima kasih banyak sekali lagi atas perhatian semuanya. Mohon maaf atas kekurangan. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat malam. Good evening, Pak Ufen. See you again.
Pamitan ya, Mas Suratno.
Ya.
Makasih.
Terima kasih
Bye.
Adib, Bu Irine.
Makasih
Selamat
Pak
malam
Andreas
juga.
Ufen.
Oh, Pak Adib masih ada ya. Terima kasih Pak Adib.
Yuk,
Terima kasih Pak Sur.
Ya. Mantap, keren.
Terima kasih.
Sampai ketemu lagi di sesi yang selanjutnya.
Ya, makasih. Bye, assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.